Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Friday at 11:15, so I hope everyone's doing good. It's pretty gray, overcast day. It's supposed to rain like crazy tonight, but hey, what else is new? So, so yeah, gonna be doing another music show. I've been doing a handful of music shows lately, and it's been a lot of fun. I like to change things up. I like to always bring variety to this channel. All of these things that I talk about are all really they're all things that I really enjoy, and I feel like music, art, and especially film, which is the main thing with this channel. But all of those things really are connected in obvious ways, and I look at those things being even more interconnected than maybe your average Joe, and especially with in regards to the influences and things that inspired me for my electronic band Quantum. So it's it's kind of to a degree, this channel is kind of autobiographical in a way of just you know shows all of the things I'm inspired by and things that I that make me want to get out of bed in the morning. So yeah, so today is going to be another music show, and I'm pretty excited about this. This is a show I feel like, because I've been talking about, I've done a lot of music shows at this point, and again, I really love taking, if I get into a certain style of music, I love to try to like trace back kind of that lineage of where maybe that sound has kind of come from. I've done that with, I've been doing some shows lately on kind of more fringe based music or art, with some electronic noise groups, and I really there's a lot of groups in that kind of genre that I really love. And I discovered a whole bunch of bands about, I don't know, probably 15 years ago that really opened up the door to me as far as, well, just, it was suddenly a whole bunch of new bands to check out. And then a lot of the bands at that time that I was listening to, I saw what their influences were. And it's that same thing of like, for instance, like a real modern band that I've done lots of coverage on, a band, for instance, Death Heaven, which I think is overall pound for pound the best rock shoegaze metal band around. And they've been around for quite a few years now, close to 10 to 12 years. So, but they're one of my favorite bands, and so what I like, for example, I I've seen lots of interviews with them, and they talked about a lot of the bands that they're into, and because I feel like Death Heaven really created they really created a unique sound. They totally stand out. They have their own identity. They have their own personality. They kind of created this style, and so over the years and stuff, getting into them and buying a lot of their albums, which I still have to buy their brand new album, which is so ridiculous that I haven't gotten it yet, but hopefully really soon. But so over time, like seeing interviews with them, I've learned about their influences and things that they're really inspired by. And in that case, that tends to always be preceding bands, bands that came out maybe 10 or 12 years before they emerged. So, and that's turned me on to a lot of other bands that came before them that kind of helped kind of shape their sound. So I do that a lot with lots of different kinds of music, and I do that a lot with film directors, and I do that a lot with movies in general. If there's a movie I come across that I really love, or a new director that I never have heard of, I'll, try to take a little bit of a deep dive and find out, okay, what were their influences and what things inspire them, and then that leads to opening up this door to all of this other content to check out. And so it's a really fun experience, and kind of an enriching experience, because I feel like you grow, and your knowledge of that particular thing really expands. So this today's show is about that same exact kind of idea or concept. So growing up, I grew up listening to metal and you know various forms of metal, and always had a real deep interest and love for hip hop and electronic music. So, but I've always, as I got a little bit older, I, really started. Well, it was at a really young age that I discovered bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth was a real kind of monumental band for me. I loved the tones that they had. I loved the aggression, but it was a different kind of sound than say the metal world, and it was more due to they had a certain kind of artfulness of how they constructed songs, but a lot of it had to do with how they tuned their guitars. They used a lot of odd and inventive tunings. So a lot of their Thurston Moore, of course, who was the principal writer for the band, they experimented with all kinds of different kinds of tunings for their guitars, and they also had a real big kind of punk influence. They also had this very noisy and very harsh sound that was a component, and a lot of which created a lot of tension and a lot of dissonance, and a real dissonant, a real. I always felt like they always had this real kind of cinematic vibe to them. And they were the one of the bands, along with like the Pixies, that I you know loved the first time I heard them. And at a really really young age, I remember buying cassettes of their music. I remember buying Sonic Youth's Goo on cassette. And Sonic Youth is still a band for me that's definitely one of my favorite rock bands of all time. And I've just have always been attracted to that sound, that dissonance that they create, that cacophony of sound, that noisy sound. And for all intents and purposes, like that was kind of my introduction to I don't know, kind of the noise music world. And I've been doing videos on some of those artists that I really really like, and so about, I don't know, it was a long time ago, but it was back when, well, when Netflix, for instance, when Netflix, the major streaming company that kind of kicked off a lot of um, things that we're seeing now as far as streaming services. Way back when Netflix first started, which was probably about 15 years ago or so. I mean, it's a long time ago now. They before they kind of went into like the streaming platform, basically, my girlfriend at the time had signed up for Netflix. It was this new thing, new way of how you could see movies. And I always had a membership to video stores. I used to go to um, Harbor Road Video, which is long dead and gone. I used to go to Movie Gallery, which was another corporate, video shop, kind of like Blockbuster. And growing up, there weren't really many Blockbusters by where I grew up, but I remember going to them at times. I think there was maybe one, but anyway, and then of course Opera House Video, which I'm still a member of their video shop, and I still go there. I'll be going there tomorrow for to get some movies. So, but along came Netflix, and as the world as we know it has changed drastically since this emergence of streaming. But when Netflix first came about, they had this new service of where, essentially they had a website and you would go to their library you would go to their website and then there was like a library format. And basically it acted like kind of a library, but it was all virtual. And you would get this queue box and you would basically click on movies that they offered that looked interesting to you. And they had at that time they had a pretty interesting mix of movies and also documentaries. At that time, I was really, really watching a lot of documentaries. I still love documentaries. I've covered lots of docs on this channel over the past couple of years. But at that time, I was checking out a lot of documentaries and things like that. I was going to the Camden Film Festival, every year. I was really kind of immersed in that, and I was seeing a lot of documentaries. And along with movies that were coming out or movies that they acquired, they had a massive documentary selection on their website. And basically, what it was is like you would find you'd go through what they had, their catalog of whatever was available to rent. And at that time, I don't think you could stream anything. You couldn't watch anything on your computer or your TV. This was way before that. I could be wrong, but I don't think you could at the first stage. And basically, you would go through the movies. And it was super cheap. I remember the fee was like ridiculously cheap. And you would click off the movies, and then you'd pay that price, whatever the fee was, but it was really little. And then basically, you have your email, and then you get the verification, and then you get the discs. And these were all actual DVDs. They were actual little DVDs, and they would come in little kind of paper containers. And then your order would be put in, and then you would get the movies, and you would have the movies for a couple of weeks or whatever. Because part of the allure of doing that was late fees. When you would go to rent movies, it was always, and it's still kind of a pain in the ass, but like with late fees, if you didn't cram in all the movies you rented, you were then charged. So that was I remember when I came across Netflix and heard about it, I was like, wow, there's no late fees. You can keep the movies as long as you want. You don't feel like you have 2 days to watch 4 movies or whatever. So that was probably the biggest attraction to it. So, and then you put in your order, and a couple of days later, the movies would come. And the plant of where Netflix was based out of, or where the movies would be coming from, would be from Portland, Maine. And I think that's still a thing. I'm not really sure, but I don't think you can't get physical media from them anymore. It's all digital. Um, so it's drastically changed. But basically, you get those tapes, the DVDs, and but the thing that was funny about it is that you could only order like 2 at a time. So you couldn't order like a bunch of them, like 5 or 6, and then just have them for a couple of months or a few weeks. You could only order 2, but if you had those 2, your order, you could keep them. You could have them as long as you want. And then when you wanted to send them back, basically you stuck it in your mailbox with the address, and then you sent it back. And then you want more movies, you just do the same thing, and you can do it. But I remember one of the first documentaries I came across was I can't remember the title, but it was a documentary about the no wave scene in New York City, and I was like, wow, what is that? That looks really, really interesting. And looking at this disc, I saw that there were interviews with like Thurston Moore and from Sonic Youth, and Dinosaur Jr. and the Pixies, and a lot of the kind of early indie rock bands that I really loved. And there was interviews with them, but the whole kind of thing about this documentary was that they were going to be taking a deep dive on music that came before them that really influenced that kind of rock sound that these bands were doing. And in the interview, so I got the disc, and it was called like No Wave or something. And it was one of the coolest documentaries I'd ever seen on music. And it really was one of those kind of pivotal moments for me as far as being a fan of music because it opened up all of these doors. And there were these interviews with Thurston Moore where basically he talked about all of the bands that he really, really loved and that really inspired him, when he was a teenager and beyond. And they they had interviews with Thurston Moore and more at that time contemporary rock artists, but then they would also really really make the focus on a lot of these bands that were the influencers. So it was really interesting, and he was in these interviews. Thurston Moore was talking a lot about bands that really inspired him in the from the 70s and early 80s that helped kind of forge their sound. And he talked about bands like Lydia Lunch and Suicide and DNA. And then it took those bands, and this was part of this kind of subculture or subgenre of music that I had never heard of before. And I was totally, totally unaware of it. And it was super cool, super fascinating. And then it focused a lot on those bands, but then it took another focus on bands that were kind of continuing that vibe or aesthetic. And it's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. I'd love to buy it. I'd love to find out what the name of that movie or doc was. I think it was called basically, I think the title of it was called No Wave. And it was so fascinating because from that, I became huge fans of these bands. It really got me into Suicide. Suicide is one of my all-time favorite electronic groups, and probably the most, these guys were doing it before anyone else in the mid to late 70s. And other bands like Lydia Lunch, and what today's show I'm going to be talking about DNA, and just incredible music. And then at that time they were talking about kind of contemporary bands that were also kind of doing that sound or continuing that sound. Groups like The Liars, which is one of my favorite rock bands, and another group which is also electronic, Black Dice. So there was like exposure to so much cool music, and the whole no wave sound was so interesting because it came out of it. Well, it was definitely it came out of the New York area, the New York City scene, in kind of the mid '70s till about the early '80s, and it was kind of it was definitely um, a punk thing. It was definitely based in the punk world, but it was also very very much. I mean, you had the new wave sound that came out. Groups like the Talking Heads and things like that that had come out of the punk world and were very influenced by it, but it had a little bit more, I guess, accessibility to it. And I love that stuff to death. But the no wave sound came out of that, which was kind of this reactionary thing. And it was trying to get away from like, the typical rock tropes, where a lot of American rock music was so influenced, and really all they did was they just basically stole everything from black culture, with the blues. And so what they were trying to do with this kind of no wave sound was get away from that and create something totally unique, and it's not based on anything that really came before. And it was very punk oriented. It really, a lot of these groups really used a lot of harsh kinds of sounds and noise. It had a very chaotic element. It was very fringe, and they were also really inspired by a lot of artists at the time. They were like the Dada movement and real experimental fringe kinds of art. So it was kind of a combination of all of these things. And one of the bands I discovered at that time was this band called DNA. And at first, I, I don't know, I watched this documentary and I got a bunch of, I immediately was like in love with all of these bands. And I remember, one of the first albums, I tracked them down. It was hard to find, but I found online. I actually had to order it, special order it. And I got this compilation which has like 30 songs on it by this band DNA. That's these guys right here. And this music was so harsh when I first heard it. And it was a compilation. It's like 30 songs. It's a combination of like two albums, and then it's a huge compilation. I mean, there's like two albums, two or three studio albums, but then there's some live stuff also. And when I first heard this music, I didn't know what to think because it was so bizarre and so strange and so, you know, in your face and aggressive, but in this kind of strange, weird way. And I knew I liked it, but I felt like I had to really be in a certain kind of state of mind to dig it. And over time, when I sat with this band and this album, I grew to really fall in love with it. And I remember when I started getting to a place of where I was really enjoying this album, I remember, telling some friends and people I was around at the time about this album and playing it for them, and they hated it. It was too weird. It was too harsh, too chaotic. So it was an interesting experience that way. It's music that is definitely kind of not, I don't know, for the faint at heart, I guess. Best way to describe it. DNA was a no wave band that was formed in 1977 by Arto Lyndsay and keyboardist Robin Crutchfield, and later joined by drummer Iko Mori on bass. They emerged on in the New York scene in this no wave sound and or scene, and kind of hard to describe their music. It's kind of DNA's music is it's kind of more of an experience. It's not really. I mean, there is melody, there is groove or rhythm to their music, but it's very well. When I first heard them, I mean, it had elements of extreme dissidence, like kind of reckless abandon. It was definitely punk inspired. It had a lot of noise, harsh noise, a lot of dissonance, and it just seemed like um, just a big cacophony of just this chaotic kind of mess. And it was really visceral. It was really raw and totally unconventional and really weird. Like none of the rhythmic kind of ideas were things that I had really ever heard before. And and it's interesting because as I got into this album, I thought, initially I liked it, but I was like, I don't know if I can listen to this regularly. And over a couple of years, I started to really get into this album, and because there's a lot of music on it. There's a ton of music, and I found myself really digging it. And now, many years later, I love this band. I think they're one of the most important, projects and bands that were ever put out that ever came to be, and in a lot of ways, massively influential on a lot of those uh, bands I mentioned in the top of the show. And it was really interesting because my first feeling of this music was that it was totally improvised, totally random, and just chaotic, and nothing was planned. It was all randomness. And when I saw an interview with the founder of the band, Arto Lyndsay, I was blown away by this interview because in the interview, Arto Lyndsay was talking about how all of their songs and all of their tunes, everything they've recorded and performed, was so intensely orchestrated and so rigid as far as the performance of the music and also the conception of the music. So it was like, in some ways, almost like classical music or like a modern classical music, where it was there was there was no improvised elements in the music, and it was so orchestrated. And they talked about Arto Lyndsay talked about when they were more or less recording a lot of these tracks. They just rehearsed these things to death and kind of put all these pieces together and never deviated from it, and that's what you got. And so when I came to that, when I saw that and found out that that's really how this music was kind of conceived, it just blew my mind away, because I'm like, wow, like how they're able to create this sound of where it just seems so like this cacophony of chaos, and it's so random, but it's like really intense. But yet, which as an outsider, you're like, oh, this is just some Joe Schmo picking up, you know, getting behind a drum set and who's never played and just bashing away kind of a thing, or any instrument. But seeing it, there was so much discipline to what they were crafting, and so much kind of thought, and it was so preconceived, just blew me away. And the other thing that was really interesting too is, like, on this compilation of DNA's music, it's got, like, again, it's got like two or three albums, and then it's got some live stuff. The interesting thing is too is, like, you have studio versions, which I've listened to a lot, and then there's live versions of some of the same tunes or tracks, and live they would replicate the studio version exactly, like, which is crazy, because you're like, wow, how did they pull that off? And it just blew my mind away as far as how this was conceived. It was wild. And a few years later, I got a little bit more familiar with Arto Lyndsay, and realized, DNA had, was was kind of ended as a band many many years ago. But he went on to do all kinds of incredibly prolific artists, Arto Lyndsay, and he has put out so many other albums that it's kind of mind blowing. I remember years after that, a friend of mine had played me an album by Arto Lyndsay, and it was all of this kind of like Brazilian electronica music, and I'm like, wait, this is the same fucking guy who did DNA? Like, it was just wild. Um, so many different kinds of styles of music, a lot of stuff I really need to get into. I mean, he was in the Lounge Lizards, which is a really big kind of indie band at the time, or later on. Um, he really explored a lot of pop music, samba music, and bossa nova. I believe he moved to Brazil also many, many years ago. The music is incredible. And one album he had put out was Envy, Greed, and Lust. Really interesting. I mean, a guy who Arto Lyndsay's a true artist and such a chameleon. Like, I've only heard a lot of these other albums, like where he did, kind of pop and some electro kind of stuff and the samba style. I've heard a lot of those albums throughout the years, and cuts from some of these albums, but the level, there's so many records he's put out, and I believe he's still really active. And again, none of this stuff resembles DNA in any way, shape, or form. For the most part, at least the stuff I had heard. But it's amazing, and that's something I need to pursue and buy a lot more of those albums. But today's show is kind of really about DNA and how I discovered Arto Lyndsay, and how it was such I don't know, a pivotal thing for me as a fan of music. So really, really cool. when you first hear DNA, it might have that same effect on you like it did me. It might be so jarring, and you might be like, I don't know, this is kind of painful. But if you have an open mind, and you might dig it over a little bit of time, and maybe it will connect with you right away. That can happen too. But yeah, really important music, really important band, and a brilliant artist, Arto Lyndsay. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.